Well, colleagues, it's my great pleasure to have the task of introducing our speaker today. Linda Botterill is Professor of Australian Public Policy and Associate Dean Research in the Faculty of Business, Government and Law at the University of Canberra. She's also a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences of Australia. Prior to Linda's academic career, she actually had another career, a career in government and public policy, working as a senior policy advisor for several cabinet ministers and industry associations as well. Linda is one of Australia's foremost public policy scholars, and she's also Australia's leading expert in drought policy. She's written numerous books on topics like drought policy, royal commissions, wheat marketing and public policy theory. She has a recent book co-authored with Alan Fenner, Interrogating Public Policy Theory, a Values Perspective, which presents a kind of call to action to encourage public policy scholars to think about the role of values in the policy process. And I think that book has turned out to be extremely prescient in the light of current controversies surrounding a number of our governing institutions and elected representatives. So today, Linda is speaking on the topic of values and rhetoric in public policy. And Linda, as we've discussed, I think you're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open up the virtual room for questions. So Linda, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Cosmo. Thank you for those kind words and for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be presenting at Griffith University, albeit virtually. I did my undergraduate at Griffith University last century when it was a very small university and not as many people had heard of it as they have today. And I've got very fond memories of living on the Nathan campus. I just would like to note that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and would like to acknowledge their ongoing contribution to the life and culture of the ACT and its surrounding areas, and extend that acknowledgement and respect to any First Nations people who are here today. So Cosmo's already given you a bit of a suggestion about the book, and there's an ad for it. This is basically the basis of today's presentation. So many of the arguments that I am putting forward to you today are expanded on in the book. As part of a plug for you, as part of the commercial, I'd like to let you know that it's not a very big book, so it doesn't take too long to read. And I hope that it's written fairly clearly so that people can understand our argument. So basically what I'm trying to argue today is that understanding politics and policy from a values perspective gives us useful insights into the nature of politics and policy and the process of persuasion. So that's basically where I'm coming from today. Now, none of this is a particularly new idea in the sense that the idea of values and politics and values and policy fitting together has been around for a very long time. So those of you who are familiar with the literature, apologies for just skimming over this, but Laswell's classic 1951 article on the policy orientation basically had values at the basis of his vision for the policy sciences. His vision was for the sum of human knowledge to contribute to a program that promoted human dignity and democracy. So it was very much a values-based vision of the policy sciences as an undertaking. And interestingly, for those of you who may not be aware of it, Laswell's own academic career actually started with an interest in personalities. He was very influenced, like many of his generation, by the work of Freud. So he actually had done some interesting work around psychopathology in politics long before he engaged in writing about the policy orientation. Simon, similarly, some influence of Freud in some of his work, but he also, in spite of being seen as in many ways the father of a very rational type of approach to bounded rationality, he recognized that bounded rationality was decision making within the bounds that are set by values. So his conception of bounded rationality had values premises and factual premises in the decision environment. So it was a combination of the facts with which you worked and arrived at a rational decision, but within the bounds of the values set by your organisation. And a simple way to think about this might be if you were a public servant and you were working on workplace relations policy under a coalition government, you'd hardly be putting forward an argument that was to strengthen trade unions. The kind of policy that you put together is bounded by the values within which your organisation functions. So Simon recognised that values were important in the decision-making process. Charles Lindblom actually mentions the word values over 70 times in his seminal article, The Science of Muddling Through. And that article actually discusses the policy process, the decision-making process, in terms of balancing competing values. Now, he has some fairly odd ideas about what constitutes a value, and I'm going to come back to that shortly, but he still makes it very clear that one of the advantages of incremental policy making is that it allows values that have been overlooked in earlier iterations of policy to be revisited in later iterations. And I think that values component of Lindblom is something that often gets missed when people look at the rationalism versus incrementalism argument, that they forget that one of the things that Lindblom thought was important about incrementalism was this values issue. So he mentions that many times. Milton Rokeach was probably one of the first attempts at actually doing some empirical work around values. He wrote a very large book on human values, which included a lot of work on politics and looking at the values basis of politics and political debate. Many of you, of course, would be aware of the work of Ronald Inglehart, who came up with the idea of post-materialist values and pointed to intergenerational differences as a consequence of the rise of post-materialism. Val Braithwaite did some work based on Rokeach's work and came up with some ideas around security and harmony values. So there's quite a lot of work being done. Deborah Stone, of course, very much saw politics in values terms and as something to be embraced in the policy process. Sabatier's advocacy coalitions idea is based on coalitions of interests protecting their deep core values. So this idea of values as being central to policy and politics is not particularly new, but it's never really been focused on. And I think there's potentially two reasons for that. One is that there's a confusion about what values are. So when I first became involved in this values project and thinking maybe values matter in politics, I started looking around for a definition and some empirical work. And I found that people had their own idiosyncratic definitions of what constitute values. And this, of course, makes it very difficult to then have a cohesive research program if everybody has their own conception of what constitutes a value. As a consequence, people have talked about values. Lindblom talked about values and so on, as I've just explained, and then they've scooted off and talked about other things. And the project that have been involved with for a long time, which then culminated in the 2019 book, has been trying to actually centre values again. And when I started working on this, I realised that these themes actually go back to my own PhD when I identified agrarian values as being very influential in rural policy and often unacknowledged. So what we've tried to do in the book is present a new perspective on understanding policy and politics that centres human values. So having said we need a definition, I'm going to give you a definition. So the top definition is from Shalom Schwartz and his colleague Wolfgang Bilski. I'm going to come back to Schwartz because I think he's a key figure who can help us develop a research program in political science and public policy going forward, which actually uses values as an analytical framework and which gives us a tool to work with. So Schwartz and Bilski have suggested that values are concepts or beliefs about desirable end states or behaviours that transcend specific situations, guide selection or evaluation of behaviour and events, and are ordered by relative importance. So values are our guides to decision making. They're our conception of good and bad, right and wrong, and they guide us through our lives. They're deep-seated, and research shows that values are established very early in life. And in fact, there's some really interesting work being done out of UWA with children as young as 4 or 5, where they're identifying that children are beginning to establish their values positions. Now, obviously, upbringing, religious commitment, schools, and so on, and lived experience impact our values, but they're very, very hard to shift. And I think you can see this in examples. For example, I think one of the classic examples for me about how values are possibly very inherent is the Costello brothers, where you've got Peter Costello, who, as we all remember, was Treasurer in the Howard government, and you've got Tim Costello, who's been very active in the charity sector. And their values are clearly quite different. So to some extent, it suggests that personality and values are inherent to the individual as well as influenced by those external impacts. So Charlotte Schwartz is a social psychologist who reviewed Rokeach's book in the early 1970s and reviewed it very positively, but came to the conclusion that, and theorised that values were in fact related and could be arrayed on a continuum. So the idea was that values are not discrete, that they are related, that they are related to each other, and that people hold these values in a way where we hold common values, but we prioritise them differently. Now, Cochon, of course, had noticed that in 1952. I won't read that quote out to you there, but that makes the same point, that people have the same values, but it's the way they prioritise them and the emphasis they put on particular values that is actually important in terms of their particular values stance. So having theorised that this was the situation, Schwartz then undertook a large empirical program of research, and the survey work he undertook proved his theory. So he has done surveys now in well over 80 countries and tens of thousands of survey respondents, and that research has shown consistently that there are 10 universal human values. And this circle that I've presented here shows those 10 universal values in the middle, and then 4 higher level values over the top, and then on the outside, basically a social or a personal focus. This is based on large amounts of quantitative research, and it's robust, and it's proved robust over many decades now. So this is someone who's done a lot of work that we as political scientists and public policy scholars can benefit from. To date, most of the research, in fact, nearly all of it, I haven't been able to find any that's not, has been quantitative research that has linked these values, these Schwartz values in individuals to particular attitudes. And this has been done across a range of disciplines. So it's been done in political attitudes, around political parties, around attitudes to particular policies. It's been done in marketing terms. It's been done across a whole array of disciplines, but it's largely been quantitative analysis of survey results. So where I'm at the moment is with some colleagues, I'm exploring the possibility of adapting these ideas for qualitative research in political science and public policy by picking up the Schwartz categories, which we know to be robust and empirically proven and derived, and then applying them to qualitative techniques such as textual analysis. We're at very, very preliminary stages of that at the moment, but it's a really exciting project to be thinking about. So this gives the basis. This actually says, okay, so we can have an agreed basis for understanding what we mean by values and what those values actually are, because we know that they're out there. If we want to do quantitative research, we can measure them. There is an instrument through which individuals can be identified to where they sit in these 10 values, where they sit in those 4 quadrants, whether they're socially focused or personally focused. And if you combine that instrument with survey questions, you can get a really good picture about the link between values and particular attitudes. So there's a lot of scope for political scientists, I think, to become much more engaged with Schwartz's work. And I've been very fortunate over the last couple of years to be working with a team at the University of Western Australia who does a lot of quantitative work in this, but they're expanding and involving political scientists like myself in their research, and it's been very exciting working with them. So just to give you a quick overview of the kinds of arguments that we make in the book around these types of issues. If we're thinking about the values basis of policy and politics, so we've established that there are 10 universal human values and that individuals prioritise them differently. So governments who are making collective decisions on our behalf obviously need to juggle those societal values when they're making policy choices. So if they are considering policy towards asylum seekers, for example, they can't take absolute extreme positions that only address one set of values. They need to be aware of the fact that there are other values in the community. Where parties come in is they provide a useful heuristic for voters because, in a sense, they encapsulate particular values priorities. So if you think about the personal versus social focus dichotomy that was in the previous slide, you can easily think in Australian political terms that, broadly speaking, the Labor Party represents more socially focused values, whereas the coalition are representing more personally focused values. So just returning to that slide, if you look at the personal focus, we've got things like power and achievement and self-direction. Whereas the social focus, universalism and benevolence, for example, are more likely to encapsulate concerns for others, the self-transcendence values, and also for the environment. So political parties become a heuristic device for voters. And a lot of research in political psychology tells us that people vote for parties based on their values. And once they've made a values choice for a party, though their own values can then be influenced by the choices that the party makes on their behalf. So there's a very deep-seated values connection in party politics. Related to that, we argue in the book that if we think about that, we can think about ideology as a systematization of values. So ideology gives us a collection of values packaged up neatly, and they are groups of these human values that we've identified. So once we move from the political arena, where people have used their values as the basis for voting, because we do need to be honest, there's very few people in the community who read every party platform in advance of an election. They've got a sense about who they're going to vote for, and that sense is values-based. They use it as a decision tool. They've chosen who to vote for. The government is elected, and then it's beginning to make policy choices. Well, the first choice it makes is what actually constitutes a problem. And this is where Deborah Stone's work is so valuable. Policy problems are constructed, and they're constructed on the basis of values. So what is constructed as a problem is about looking over here, not over there. Something is constructed as a problem, not just what constitutes a problem, but how it's constructed. So simple examples, which I'm sure you would all spring to mind for all of you, is the issue of unemployment. If you construct unemployment as a bunch of lazy sods sitting on their backside who can't be bothered getting a job, you have punitive type welfare responses. But if you construct unemployment as being a failure of the economy to deliver high-paying quality jobs, then you have a different policy response. And those policy constructions, in the first instance, are clearly values-based in terms of how you view society and individuals within that society. Related to this, of course, is the work of the construction of target populations. Many of you will be familiar with Schneider and Ingram's work on this, where they talk about how policymakers and the community construct particular groups in the community as being deserving or undeserving of support. In my own work, I've done a lot of work around the construction of farmers. And they are a group in the community that is almost consistently constructed as deserving and worthwhile of support across the political spectrum. We've got survey results and published survey work that shows that agrarian sentiment in Australia is very strong right across demographics and right across voting intentions, which construct farmers as being worthwhile members of the community and farming as a noble undertaking, giving governments a lot of scope in terms of the policy support that they can offer to farmers and rural communities. And in many cases, that support is more generous than the support that is offered to other members of the community in similar circumstances. All of these choices are values-based. Agrarianism is a very strong value set that dates back to Aristotle and is consistent across Western developed societies. So of course, that then reflects in framing and agenda setting. Again, the idea of agenda setting is you're selecting the areas for attention, and those choices are going to be based on values. And the way you frame an issue, as I've been describing, is based on values. So that brings me to the question of rhetoric and persuasion. So if you're going to create a policy problem and you're going to construct a policy problem and then you're going to propose a solution, you need to persuade the community that your construction of that problem is correct, and you need to persuade them that your answer is also correct. You need to persuade others in the policy community of your perception of the problem and your perception and suggestion for the solution. And that process of rhetoric uses values appeals. Effective rhetors actually appeal to people's common values. And many of you would be familiar with the literature on rhetoric, which talks about appealing to common values and bringing the audience along with you. And we see this used very effectively when politicians, for example, use sport metaphors, because they're appealing to people's values and interests in sport, and then they draw them in and bring them along with them. And the use of values appeals is critical. At the moment, I have an undergraduate research intern doing some really interesting work looking at the way Dan Andrews effectively used different types of values appeals in his daily press conferences during the height of the COVID-19 crisis last year in Victoria, and already has identified the use of sporting metaphors, for example, in persuading Victorians that they should continue with lockdown and continue with social distancing. So if we think about values as being important in politics, one area where it's really worthwhile having a look is how people persuade, how they use different values to convince different audiences. So I'd like to finish with an example, and this is hot off the presses. This was published yesterday online, so I'm very excited to be able to talk about this. This is research that was led by my colleagues out of UWA. Joshua Lake, who I hope is here today, is a PhD student in political science at UWA. I'm privileged to be one of his supervisors. He's the lead author on this study that was published yesterday in Personality and Individual Differences, in which we report the research that was driven out of UWA looking at the connections between values and COVID-19 social distancing attitudes and behaviour, and also likelihood of being vaccinated against COVID-19. And that research used the Schwartz values, and it asked a series of questions about COVID-safe behaviours, and also we tested a series of messages around social distancing. And those messages were constructed to appeal to the different values in the Schwartz circle. So some of them were socially focused, some of them were personally focused. And our findings showed that values predict social distancing attitudes and behaviours. So for political scientists and people interested in political communication, this says that if you want to persuade people to act in the public interest, particularly with a collective action problem like public health, you need to appeal to their values. So if you are a politician trying to persuade, one of the ways to do this is to frame your messages in different ways to tap into the different values priorities of your audience. So if you stick with a single message that it's for the good of the community, you're not necessarily going to convince people who are much more individually focused or much more in the self-enhancement area of the Schwartz values. So I'm going to stop there because I'd like to give people the opportunity to ask some questions. I've got about 3 pages of references that follow on from this presentation, and I'm very happy to share these slides with everybody for anyone who would like to follow up those references. So over to you, Cosmo. I'm happy to take questions.